Hello everyone, I'm Brian. Today I'm reacting to Gross Suffering, Subtle Suffering with subtitles. So, I never thought to distinguish them. Suffering is suffering, which is true, but it could help to distinguish them. So, gross suffering, which is the body, I believe, and subtle suffering, which is the mind? So, obviously, you have physical pain, missing limbs, cuts in your arms or bruises. Then subtle suffering, which is more like memory. I wish I would have done that. I wish I didn't do that. But that's what I think it is. So let's go ahead and get started.
Actually, we're all suffering right now. There's subtle and gross suffering. Gross suffering is obvious: sickness, death, old age, things like they cut us off, or we lose money, or we lose someone we love, and all that. That's gross suffering. Subtle suffering is not knowing that we're suffering, and not knowing the methods for suffering, and thinking that this is happiness, and continuing what we're doing. That's subtle suffering, and that suffering is much worse to pull out than gross suffering. People run around feeding the poor. People running around taking care of the sick, and that's wonderful. That's gross suffering. But that type of relief doesn't bring you to ultimate liberation. Subtle suffering is not knowing the cause of suffering, not even knowing you're suffering, suffering without knowing you're suffering. Why? Having a human body is pure suffering. It's smelly. Every day it's high maintenance. It's a lot of work. We fight. We do all kinds of things to entertain it, to make it nice. We dress it. We have to take care of it. We have to feed it. We have to wash it. And it fails us with sickness. It's very delicate. Any of the balances go off, any of the elemental balances go off, we immediately become sick. We age, we can't control, we get fat. We're attractive, not attractive. And in the end, the body again becomes our biggest traitor, where it dies. So our body is not an actual object of veneration. It's not an actual object that we should rest in and be happy about.
It's very strange to say that, helping others or to suffer without knowing that you're suffering. That's kind of strange. I don't know what to think about that because whenever I've heard this in negative manners, and what I mean by that is, it's more. I don't know if I don't. I'm trying to remember where I heard it from, but it's more along the lines. It's a way of making people seem like they're doing something wrong, or that they are suffering when they're not, just to get them to do something. So, but it's kind of strange that he says that feeding is great, but you're suffering. I hope he goes a little bit more detail because that's a bit confusing for me. I mean, a bit weird. It's like, why is that?
It is a method or a vehicle for us to reach a higher state. And if we view the body as that, we don't become attached. And we use the body beneficially for others. And the body becomes a cause for happiness and not suffering. Meaning, we use the body to create more causes for happiness, instead of it being a vehicle to more unhappiness. Why? We can use it negatively if we don't know what we're doing. And the worst thing, the subtle suffering, is not knowing what you're doing. Not knowing. So we live in blissful ignorance, which doesn't lead to bliss. So when we attend Dharma talks and we get knowledge, this counters that. You see, you think, but if I know all that, I'll be scared. What's the difference? The result will be the same. At least if you know, you have a chance of doing something about it. If you don't know, it's not blissful ignorance. It's ignorance, full stop. So when we see someone having very powerful karma arising, that's more than a normal type of suffering. It's not a life lesson. It's a samsara lesson. It's a lesson of samsara in all your lives. If you do negative action, that will arise, not just now, again and again and again, and worse. So it's not a life lesson, it's a samsara lesson for all lives. 1. 2, it's a result of karma ripening, opening. 3, it shows you clearly you didn't do anything about it to prevent it. Purification. And from that suffering, you'll see people do even more things that are negative as an excuse. And most of us say, yeah, that's right, he had to steal because, whatever. And that justification becomes bigger. He hurt me, that's why I hurt him. They hurt me, that's why I hurt them. And it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. And we create more suffering from that suffering. So it's not a lesson unless you actually learn something. See, some people go through tremendous mental pain and problems, difficulties and sufferings, and then they come to the Dharma. And when they come to the Dharma, they listen, they transform. So the suffering in that case is wonderful. And there's some people who have suffering and they do even worse things. Worse things. It's like that lady during Buddha's time whose only child died. Oh God, she was so distraught. In her arms, so distraught. This is in Buddha's biography. She went mad. She ran around everywhere asking people to revive her baby. And there was no one left. They told her about a sage who performs miracles. Siddhartha Gautama. So she found her way to his retreat, Lord Buddha's retreat, and placed the baby in front of him and said, they say you're a sage. They say you're a Buddha. They say that you are enlightened. Please bring my baby back to life because I love it. Buddha says, I will. I will bring that baby back to life. No problem. But one condition, she says, anything, I'll do anything. Find me a household that there has never been a death. She goes, okay, I'll do it. She left her baby there. She ran everywhere. Every single household. Oh, did anybody die here? Yes, my mother died. Anybody die here? My sister died. Anybody died? My uncle died. My grandmother died. And every single house, after hundreds of houses, her mind started to calm down, and she realized that she wasn't alone, and that that's a part of life, that everybody experiences that, and there's no escape, and that her sorrow is baseless. The extent of her sorrow is baseless. And her mind calmed down. And she came back to the Buddha and told him, I understand.
Again, my mind thinks in a weird way. Before I make this comment, I could only imagine, what if, obviously, the human population is growing. What if they did build a brand new house and a couple just moved in? Has anyone died in this house? They'll probably say no. I do wonder what would happen then. Like, I mean, I get the story. I do understand, and it's honestly a very good teaching lesson. I'm wondering why she didn't know that in the first place. Did she not? Then maybe her grandparents never died yet, and maybe no one in her life that she knows has died yet. That would be that'd be the only case, is the reason why she would not understand that death happens around us. But I was just thinking, what if, obviously houses are built and people move into brand new houses where no one has died in the house. Or maybe it's more along the lines of, is it a house or is it a family? Where's Basin? A household. Probably the story is, talk to a family where no one has died. Maybe that. Better that than household. Probably. Unless household in this translation means like families. Obviously every family has had someone die. There's not a single family in the world where no one has died. But households is a bit of a different story. So now it makes more sense for me now that when you say family, go to a family that no one has died, and then, yeah, that's impossible. But again, my mind thinks in weird ways.
May I please receive the Dharma? Buddha says, you're very welcome to. And taught the Dharma to her, and gave her the teachings. And in that single life, she became an arhat. One who is free from samsara, that doesn't need to take rebirth. She became an arhat because she used her sufferings in a way that turned it all around. That's a life lesson for her. So when we have sufferings, and we reciprocate the sufferings to others because we're suffering, that's not a life lesson. That's increasing more lessons for us to learn, and we might not even learn.
Hold on, let me rewind that one.
We have suffered, turned it all around.
Okay.
That's a life lesson for her. So when we have sufferings, and we reciprocate the sufferings to others because we're suffering, that's not a life lesson. That's increasing more lessons for us to learn, and we might not even learn. It's very, very important. Suffering is suffering, but it should be used to cessate suffering in the future. It should be used in a way that stops all suffering, not to increase. And that's what the Dharma does for us. The Dharma tells us the truth with compassion and acceptance. With compassion and acceptance. And that's very hard to get in this world.
So I think I understand this. I'm still a bit confused about the subtle suffering. I thought subtle was the mind, like thinking of things that are not physically happening to you. Emotional is physical because it's chemical, but thoughts are chemicals too. But I guess it's seen a bit differently, perhaps. I don't know. Gross and suffering, gross and subtle, I've heard a few times. I know gross is the body. Subtle, I thought, is the mind. Let me know if I'm right or wrong. So, obviously, gross is, I completely understand it. It's literally the physical body. Whether that includes emotional or not? I think it does. And then thoughts, which is memories. I think that's subtle. So, but this one he says subtle is, or gross is even memory. Which I get, your brain stores memory, so it's technically physical with chemical reactions. But subtle in this one, he says, is suffering without knowing you're suffering, which is, at least from my understanding of the subtle word, is subtle suffering. You're suffering and not even knowing it. It's very subtle. But it's really weird when he says that, helping others, like giving them food, helping someone is still not a good thing. Let's see if I could find that one. Oh, here it is, I think.
Suffering is not knowing that we're suffering and not knowing the methods for suffering and thinking that this is happiness and continuing what we're doing. That's subtle suffering, and that suffering is much worse to pull out than gross suffering. People run around feeding the poor, people running around taking care of the sick, and that's wonderful. That's gross suffering. But that type of relief doesn't bring you to ultimate liberation.
Okay.
Subtle suffering is not knowing the cause of suffering, not even knowing you're suffering, suffering without knowing you're suffering.
Okay.
Why? Having a human body is pure suffering.
Okay, so basically saying, helping and feeding people is gross suffering. Okay.
Subtle suffering is not knowing the cause of suffering, not even knowing you're suffering, suffering without knowing you're suffering. Why? Having a human body is pure suffering. It's smelly.
Okay, and it says subtle suffering is not even knowing you're suffering. That stuff is much worse to pull out than gross suffering.
People running around feeding the poor, people running around taking care of the sick, and that's wonderful. That's gross suffering. But that type of relief.
Okay. Okay, so never mind. I misunderstood that one because he was talking about gross, subtle suffering, and then says that's gross suffering. So essentially, okay, feeding the sick, not feeding the sick, helping the sick and feeding the hungry is gross suffering. Yes, I get that. Helping with the gross suffering. But again, subtle suffering is not knowing the cause of the suffering or not knowing that you're suffering. So this is the lack of knowledge of suffering. It's really weird to say that. I think he says it right here in the very beginning. Right here, I think.
Or we lose someone we love and all that. That's gross suffering. Subtle suffering is not knowing that we're suffering and not knowing the methods for suffering and thinking that this is happiness.
And thinking that this is happiness. So imagine you doing something and it's making you happy, but is it really? I think maybe in this sense, a lot of people interpret what they do as happiness. As in, they do something and they say, this is good. This is happiness. This is good. They're saying this in their mind because they want it to be good. It's not the fact that it's automatically good for them, but they want it to be good. I want to do good. I want this to make me happy. I want this to be great. I want this to end my suffering. Kind of deal. As opposed to, I'm happy doing this. This is fantastic, man. I hope I can do this tomorrow. Kind of deal. The difference in attitude. The difference in how you're actually enjoying what you're doing. Is that, I'm wondering if that's what he means. Where, someone will do something for clout. I guess, I don't know if that's a word that's very known, but someone will do something to get praises. And say, I'm doing this because I want to get praise. I'm doing this because it's a good thing and people will see me doing good. And it'll make me happy. Kind of deal. I wonder if that's what it means there. Like, they think that what they're doing is making them happy, but in reality, it's not, because they're doing it for some type of gain. So it's not actual happiness until they get the gain. And what they're hoping for is what they're doing will gain them that gain of happiness. So it's not genuine happiness, but it's doing something to obtain it. I wonder if that's what it means by that. Anyways, let me know. Anyways, I thought this was pretty interesting. I thought he'd kind of define gross and subtle suffering. But again, I wonder if it's a bit different definition of gross and subtle between his, I believe it's Buddhism versus Hinduism. I wonder if they're just used a little bit differently in the two contexts of cultures. Anyways, let me know. If you like my content, please consider subscribing, thumbs up, thumbs down below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next vid.